June 24th, 1948. Berlin is a ghost. 3 years after the fall of the Third Reich, the former capital of a dead empire is a landscape of skeletons. Buildings stand like hollowed-out skulls, their windows vacant eyes staring into nothingness. The stench of rubble and decay still hangs heavy in the air. This is the epicenter of the new, fractured world. After the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Germany was carved up between the victors: America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was a special case, a microcosm of the larger division. The city itself was split into 4 sectors. The western sectors, American, British, and French, became a tiny island of democracy and capitalism, a fragile outpost surrounded by an ocean of Red Army troops. 2 million Germans lived on this island, trapped between the memory of a monstrous past and the fear of an uncertain future. For 3 years, a tense and fragile peace had held. But in early 1948, the Western powers made a decision that lit the fuse. To combat runaway inflation and stabilize the shattered German economy, they announced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. This was an act of economic self-defense, but for Joseph Stalin, sitting in the Kremlin, it was an act of war. He saw it as the West building a separate, hostile German state on his doorstep. His response was swift, total, and brutal. At exactly midnight on June 24th, Soviet forces executed Order Number 11. Every road, every railway line, and every canal leading from the western zones of Germany into West Berlin was severed. No trucks carrying food, no trains delivering coal, no barges shipping medicine. The island was cut off completely. Stalin's logic was simple and cruel. He was a master of siege warfare, a student of Ivan the Terrible. He would strangle the city. He would turn off the electricity, cut off the food, and let the coming winter do the rest. The Allies, he calculated, would have 3 choices. Try to break the blockade on the ground. This would mean sending armored columns through Soviet territory, an act that would inevitably lead to shooting, which would inevitably lead to World War III, a war the West was not prepared to fight. Negotiate. This would mean coming to Moscow, hat in hand, and admitting that the new currency was a mistake. Stalin would win a massive political victory, proving that the West was a paper tiger. Abandon the city, the most likely outcome in Stalin's mind. The Allies would evacuate their garrisons, maybe some key German personnel, and leave the 2 million citizens of West Berlin to their fate. Communism would swallow the city, and the dream of a free Germany would die in its cradle. President Truman, sitting in the White House 7,000 miles away, was a man underestimated by everyone, including himself. He knew this was about more than a currency dispute. This was the first major battle of the Cold War. If America abandoned Berlin, every nation in Europe, from Paris to Athens, would learn the lesson Stalin wanted to teach. American promises are worthless. The Marshall Plan, the newly forming idea of NATO, the entire post-war order, it would all turn to dust. West Berlin had enough food for 36 days and enough coal for 45. The clock was ticking. The math was simple and brutal. Either the Allies give up, or 2 million people will freeze and starve to death. But Stalin made one critical, fatal miscalculation. He didn't count on the stubborn, mule-headed nature of a farmer's son from Missouri, and he didn't count on the sheer, impossible audacity of an idea that seemed to defy the laws of physics, feeding an entire metropolis from the sky. Washington, D.C., June 28, 1948. The air in the Oval Office is thick with tension and cigarette smoke. It's sweltering outside, a typical humid Washington summer day, but inside, the temperature is dropping as the chilling reality sets in. Truman's cabinet is gathered around the heavy oak desk, and the mood is grim. This isn't just a crisis meeting. It's a funeral wake for the city of Berlin. The men in this room, Secretary of State George Marshall, Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are the architects of victory in World War II. They are men who don't scare easily. But today, they are terrified. The options on the table are all bad. Kenneth Royal speaks first, his voice heavy with resignation. He lays out the military reality. The U.S. Army has been demobilized. The troops remaining in Europe are outnumbered 10-1 by the Soviet Red Army. If the U.S. tries to push an armored convoy through to Berlin, Stalin's tanks will crush them in hours. It would be a massacre, the start of a war the America isn't ready to fight. Mr. President, Royal suggests, we should withdraw. We should pull our people out while we still can. The logic is sound.
Berlin is indefensible. It's a strategic liability, a hostage situation waiting to happen. Why risk New York or London for a ruined enemy capital? General Lucius Clay, the commander on the ground in Germany, is on the phone line, his voice crackling with static but clear in its intensity. Clay is a hawk. He wants to fight. He proposes sending an armed convoy with engineering battalions to break the blockade by force. If they shoot, we shoot back, Clay argues. It's a gamble that could incinerate the world. Truman listens, his face unreadable behind his thick glasses. He knows that Clay's plan is too dangerous, but Royal's plan is too cowardly. Then the discussion turns to the wildest idea of all, an airlift. The Royal Air Force has already calculated the numbers, and they are depressing. To keep West Berlin alive at a subsistence level, meaning just enough food so people don't die, and just enough coal so they don't freeze, the city needs 4,500 tons of supplies every single day. 4,500 tons. The current capacity of the U.S. and British air fleets in Europe? Maybe 700 tons. The math is impossible. It's like trying to fill a swimming pool with a teaspoon. The experts shake their heads. It can't be done, Mr. President, they say. The planes will break down. The pilots will burn out. The weather will kill us. And even if everything goes perfectly, we can't move that much coal by air. It's never been done. Truman looks around the room. He sees fear. He sees calculation. He sees men trying to find a way to lose gracefully. But Harry Truman didn't become president to oversee the retreat of American power. He thinks about the message a withdrawal would send to the Italians, facing their own communist threat. He thinks about the French, shaky and scared. He realizes that Berlin is no longer just a city. It is the linchpin of the entire free world. If the domino falls here, it falls everywhere. He takes a breath, cuts through the noise, and delivers 5 words that will define the Cold War. He doesn't shout. He doesn't pound the table. He just says it with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a man who has made up his mind. We stay in Berlin, period. The room goes silent. The order is absolute. No negotiation, No evacuation, no surrender. Truman turns to his skeptical generals and gives them a new directive. Don't tell me why we can't do it. Tell me what you need to get it done. He is staking his presidency, his historical legacy, and the lives of thousands of airmen on a logistical miracle. He is betting on that American industrial power and sheer human stubbornness can overcome the laws of probability. Operation Vittles is born not out of confidence, but out of necessity. The code name sounds almost ridiculous, like a church picnic or a charity drive. But it is about to become the most audacious, complex, and dangerous logistical operation in human history. The first weeks of the airlift are pure chaos. The logistical machine hasn't started running smoothly yet. It's grinding its gears. The pilots are flying vintage C-47 Skytrains, battered veterans of World War II that were never designed for this kind of relentless, round-the-clock abuse. They take off from air bases in western Germany, like Rhein-Main and Wiesbaden, climbing into gray, hostile skies. The flight path is a nightmare. The agreement with the Soviets only guarantees 3 narrow air corridors, each just 20 miles wide. Deviate even slightly to the left or right, and you are in restricted Soviet airspace. Fair game for MiG fighters waiting like sharks. The margin for error is 0. The pilots are exhausted, flying on coffee, cigarettes, and nerves, knowing that one mechanical failure over the Russian zone means capture or death. On the ground in Berlin, the mood is desperate. People stand on the ruins of their homes, watching the sky with a mixture of disbelief and terrified hope. The drone of engines is constant, a low rumble that shakes the windows. But is it enough? 700 tons a day isn't feeding the city. Rations are cut. People are boiling potato peels for soup. The specter of starvation is creeping back into the city. Then, amidst the gloom and the grinding machinery of survival, a moment of pure, unscripted humanity changes everything. A young American pilot named Gale Halvorson, a farm boy from Utah with a camera and a pocket full of gum, is standing near the fence at Tempelhof Airport. He sees a group of German children watching the planes land. These are kids who have known only war, bombing, and hunger. They don't ask him for food. They don't beg. They just ask if he can tell them which plane is his so they can wave. Halvorson is struck by their dignity. He reaches into his pocket, finds 2 sticks of doublemint, and breaks them in half and hands them through the fence. The reaction stuns him. The kids don't fight. They share the tiny pieces, sniffing the wrappers just to smell the sugar.
Halvorson makes a promise. "I'll drop enough for everyone tomorrow," he says. "How will we know it's you?" they ask. "I'll wiggle my wings," he replies. That night, back in his barracks, Halvorson uses his own rations, chocolate bars, gum, raisins, and ties them to tiny parachutes made from handkerchiefs. The next day, on approach to Berlin, he rocks his C-54's wings and pushes the cargo out the flare chute. Down below, the kids go wild. He does it again the next day, and the next. Soon other pilots join in. They pool their rations. The Operation Little Vittles is born. The press catches wind of it. A German newspaper publishes a story about Der Schokoladenflieger. Suddenly, Halvorson is famous. Letters addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings or the Uncle Chocolate flood the base. American schoolchildren start sending candy to Germany to be dropped. The Berlin Airlift transforms from a grim military necessity into a global symbol of compassion. It becomes a story not just about coal and flour, but about the moral difference between the two superpowers. The Americans are dropping chocolate. The Soviets are starving children. The propaganda victory is devastating. In the Kremlin, Stalin is furious. This candy bomber is undoing his entire narrative. He orders his generals to tighten the screws. The harassment campaign begins. Soviet Yak-3 fighters start buzzing the cargo planes, flying head-on and breaking away at the last second, trying to force the tired American pilots to flinch and crash. Soviet searchlights blind pilots during critical night landings. Anti-aircraft guns fire practice rounds that explode dangerously close to the flight paths. The radio waves are jammed with Soviet opera music or false instructions. The message is clear: leave or we will kill you. But Truman doesn't blink. He quietly ups the ante. He orders 60 B-29 Superfortress bombers, the same planes that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, to deploy to bases in Britain, well within striking distance of Moscow. He doesn't say they are carrying nukes, but the implication is terrifyingly clear. It's a silent, high-stakes poker game. Truman is telling Stalin, shoot down one of my cargo planes, and you start a war that ends with mushroom clouds over Red Square. The Soviets back off. Barely. The harassment continues, but they don't pull the trigger. The airlift continues, flying through the valley of the shadow of death, carried on the wings of chocolate and steel. By late summer, the romance of the candy bomber is overshadowed by the cold, hard reality of logistics. The operation is failing. The tonnage isn't high enough. The planes are disorganized. The crews are breaking down. Enter Major General William Tunner. They call him Willie the Whip. He is a cold, calculating genius of logistics, the man who commanded the legendary Hump Airlift over the Himalayas during the war. When Tunner arrives in Wiesbaden, he is appalled by what he sees: cowboys in the cockpit, crews sleeping on cargo sacks, planes circling aimlessly in bad weather. He realizes this isn't an operation, it's a circus, and he is here to tame it. Tunner's philosophy is simple. Airlift is not a glamorous adventure. It is a steady, rhythmic beat. It should be boring. He sets out to turn the chaotic airlift into a boring, predictable, unstoppable factory line. He redesigns everything. He standardizes the flight paths. Planes fly in one corridor, unload, and fly out another. It's a massive one-way conveyor belt in the sky. He synchronizes the speed of every aircraft. He hires German civilians, former Luftwaffe mechanics, housewives, teenagers, to work the ground crews. But his most radical change comes after Black Friday, August 13, 1948. On that day, bad weather causes a pile-up over Berlin. Planes are stacking up in the clouds, blindly circling. 3 planes crash within minutes. It's a disaster. Tunner takes drastic action. He gets on the radio and orders every single plane in the air to return to base immediately. He wipes the slate clean. Then he institutes a new ironclad rule. If you miss your landing approach, you don't circle. You don't try again. You bring your cargo back to West Germany. The penalty for failure is a wasted trip. The pilots hate it, but it works. The rhythm is established. The goal sounds insane. A plane landing every 3 minutes. then every 2 minutes, then every 63 seconds. Tunner turns Tempelhof Airport into a Formula One pit stop. Ground crews rush the plane the moment wheels touch tarmac. They have exactly 30 minutes to unload 10 tons of cargo. Tunner realizes the crews are wasting time getting out of the planes to get food, so he brings the food to them. Mobile snack bars, staffed by beautiful German women, drive up to the cockpits to hand out coffee and hot dogs while the engines are still running. The pilots never leave their seats. The planes never stop vibrating.
By December, the operation is humming, but a new enemy arrives: General Winter. Berlin freezes. Temperatures plunge to -20 degrees. The canals freeze solid. The demand for coal skyrockets. Coal is dirty, heavy, and dangerous. Coal dust gets everywhere. It coats the instruments, blinds the pilots, and turns lungs black. It's also explosive. One spark in a dust-filled cargo hold could blow a plane apart mid-air. But coal is life. Without it, the 2 million people below will freeze in their unheated apartments. So the pilots become coal miners in the sky. They fly planes stripped of everything but the essentials to save weight. They fly through blinding snowstorms, trusting their instruments and Tunner's rhythm. The statistics become mind-boggling. In January 1949, despite the weather, the airlift delivers 171,000 tons. Stalin's blockade isn't just failing, it's backfiring spectacularly. The Soviets expected the airlift to collapse under the weight of winter. Instead, it gets stronger. The roar of the engines becomes the heartbeat of Berlin, a constant, reassuring thrum that tells the people below, "We are still here. We haven't forgotten you." Tunner has done the impossible. He has turned the sky into a highway. And on that highway, freedom is arriving one plane at a time, every 63 seconds, 24 hours a day, relentless and unstoppable. History books often talk about tonnage, logistics, and political chess games, but they sanitize the blood. The Berlin Airlift wasn't free. It was bought with the lives of young men who were asked to do the impossible in conditions that were suicidal. Flying overloaded war-weary cargo planes in the worst European winter in decades was not a job. It was a death sentence with a delay. The pilots flew 16-hour shifts, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, battling fog so thick they couldn't see their own wingtips. Fatigue was a silent, constant killer in the cockpit. One moment of closed eyes, one miscalculation of altitude, and you were dead. In total, 78 airmen, 31 Americans, 39 British, and several German ground crew paid the ultimate price. Their planes crashed into the dense black forests of Germany, slammed into apartment buildings in Berlin during blind approaches, or simply exploded mid-air due to mechanical failures caused by relentless overuse. One particularly tragic crash happened at Vosburg. A C-54 Skymaster, heavy with coal, smashed into the runway in blinding snow. The fuel tanks ruptured and the coal dust ignited, turning the plane into a blast furnace. There were no survivors. The wreckage burned for hours, a grim, flaming beacon to every other pilot taking off that night. This is not a drill. This is war by other means.
But in the midst of this tragedy, something profound shifted in the human soul of the city. Before the airlift, Americans and Berliners were bitter enemies. Just 3 years earlier, these same pilots were dropping high explosives on this very city, blowing up homes and killing families. The Germans saw them as conquerors. The Americans saw the Germans as Nazis. But now the dynamic had inverted. These young men were dying to feed the children of their former enemies. When American planes crashed in Berlin, Berliners didn't cheer. They rushed into the burning wreckage, tearing at the metal with their bare hands to pull the pilots out. They held spontaneous funerals for the fallen airmen, covering their coffins with flowers scavenged from the ruins. Thousands of Berliners stood in silence as the bodies were carried away, treating them not as occupiers, but as martyrs. The airlift didn't just break the blockade. It buried the hatred of World War II in the frozen ground of Berlin. It turned former enemies into blood brothers. While the planes were waging a battle for survival over Berlin, Harry Truman was fighting for his political life back home. It was the autumn of 1948, an election year, and in the smoke-filled back rooms of Washington, everyone, literally everyone, had written Truman's political obituary. His approval ratings were in the toilet, hovering around 36%. The newspapers called him incompetent, a little man trying to fill Roosevelt's giant shoes. His own party tried to dump him. His opponent, the polished and confident Republican Thomas Dewey, was so sure of victory that he was reportedly already picking out curtains for the Oval Office.
Critics on both the left and the right attacked him. Isolationists screamed that Truman was risking World War III for a ruined German city that wasn't worth one American life. Fiscal conservatives shouted that the airlift was a spectacular waste of taxpayer money, a stunt that would inevitably fail when winter hit. Stalin knew this. He had timed the blockade specifically to break Truman before the election. He calculated that a weak, unpopular president facing a hostile electorate would fold under pressure or lose to someone more willing to negotiate. Stalin wasn't just blockading a city. He was trying to rig an American election from Moscow. But Truman used Berlin to prove his critics wrong. He didn't campaign as a politician. He campaigned as a commander-in-chief. While Dewey gave vague, boring speeches about unity and platitudes, Truman went on the offensive. He pointed to the sky over Berlin and said, "We are saving democracy." The airlift became the silent, powerful backdrop of his famous whistle-stop train campaign. Every plane landing in Berlin was a campaign poster for Truman's spine. It showed the American people that beneath the haberdasher's suit and the thick glasses was a man of steel. He wasn't afraid of Stalin, and he wasn't afraid of the Poles. On Election Day, November 2, 1948, the miracle in Berlin was matched by a miracle in America. Truman won the greatest upset victory in U.S. history. The Chicago Tribune had already printed the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," and sent it to newsstands, a mistake that would become iconic. They were wrong because they underestimated the man from Missouri, just as Stalin had. The American people looked at Berlin and saw a leader who didn't blink in a staring contest with the devil. Truman's stubborn refusal to abandon Berlin convinced the voters that he was the only man tough enough to handle the Cold War. The airlift didn't just save a city. It saved a presidency and validated the strategy of containment. The Berlin Blockade was a strategic gamble by Stalin designed to drive the Allies out of Europe. He wanted to humiliate the United States, expose its weakness, and force it to retreat across the Atlantic. Instead, he achieved the exact opposite. He cemented the Americans in Europe forever. Before 1948, the Western Alliance was loose, disorganized, and terrified. Countries like France were paralyzed by the fear of a rearmed Germany and looked at America with suspicion. Britain was bankrupt, its empire crumbling. The U.S. Congress was tired of war and wary of entangling alliances. Stalin hoped the blockade would exploit these cracks, turning the Allies against each other and shattering the West. He wanted to prove that when push came to shove, America wouldn't fight for Europe. He miscalculated spectacularly. The fear of Soviet aggression did what diplomacy never could. It terrified Western Europe into unity. They watched Berlin being strangled and realized a chilling truth. If Stalin could do this to Berlin today, he could do it to Paris, Rome, or London tomorrow. The airlift proved that they couldn't survive alone. They needed a permanent shield. They needed America. On April 4, 1949, while the planes were still landing every minute in Berlin, roaring overhead as a reminder of the threat, 12 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. It was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in its history, the United States entered into a permanent, peacetime military alliance outside the Western Hemisphere. NATO was born. The heart of the treaty was Article 5, a simple sentence with nuclear implications. An armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all. It was a direct warning to Moscow, written in the ink of the Berlin crisis. Without the blockade, NATO might never have happened. Stalin's aggression forced the West to organize, rearm, and unite under American leadership. He wanted to push America out of Europe. Instead, he invited America to stay permanently. The Iron Curtain didn't move forward. It hit a wall of solid steel, forged in the skies over Berlin. The lifting of the blockade on May 12, 1949, wasn't just the end of a siege, it was the birth of a new world order. As the first trucks rolled across the border, greeted by cheering crowds throwing flowers, the city of Berlin officially became the epicenter of the Cold War. It was no longer just a dot on a map. It was a living, breathing experiment in two competing ideologies. The airlift had transformed West Berlin from a ruin to a fortress of freedom. The economy began to boom. Shops that had been empty were now filled with goods. The rubble was cleared, not by forced labor, but by a people energized by the knowledge that the world's greatest superpower had their back.
The candy bombers had dropped more than just chocolate. They had dropped hope. They planted seeds of gratitude that grew into a fierce, unshakable loyalty to the West. West Berlin became a glittering showcase of capitalism, a neon-lit island of prosperity right in the middle of the grim gray Soviet bloc. On the other side of the Brandenburg Gate, in East Berlin, the reality was starkly different. The failure of the blockade was a humiliating defeat for Stalin and the German communists. They had tried to starve their neighbors into submission, and they had failed in front of the whole world. to stop their own people from fleeing to the prosperous West, voting with their feet, the Soviets realized they couldn't compete with open borders. They had to lock their people in. This realization would eventually lead, 12 years later, to the construction of the Berlin Wall. The wall was the ultimate admission of defeat for the Soviet system. It proved that the only way communism could keep its citizens was by turning their country into a prison. But the spirit of the airlift lived on. The memory of those 15 months when the sky roared with freedom engines kept West Berliners going through the darkest days of the Cold War. They knew they weren't alone. They knew that if they were threatened again, the world would come for them. When President John F. Kennedy visited the city in 1963 and famously said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," he wasn't just making a speech. He was standing on the foundation built by Harry Truman, General Tunner, and the pilots of 1948. The airlift proved that freedom isn't just an abstract concept debated by philosophers. It's something tangible. It's something you deliver ton by ton, day by day, risking your life in a freezing cockpit, no matter the cost. Harry Truman left office in 1953 with the lowest approval ratings in American history. He was mocked by the press, dismissed by the intellectuals, and often hated by the public for the Korean War and domestic scandals. He left Washington quietly, taking the train back to Independence, Missouri, carrying his own suitcase. But history has a funny way of correcting the record. As the decades passed and the dust of the Cold War settled, the true magnitude of his decisions came into focus. Today, the Berlin Airlift is seen not just as a logistical success, but as Truman's finest hour. It was the moment the United States finally accepted its role as the guardian of the free world. It was a victory, won not with atomic bombs or tank divisions, but with flour, coal, and milk. It was a triumph of logistics over tyranny, of stubborn hope over calculated starvation. Truman proved something profound. You don't always need to fire a shot to win a war. Sometimes you just need the courage to stand your ground when everyone else is telling you to run. He looked Joseph Stalin, the man who had terrified Europe for decades, in the eye and didn't blink. He saved 2 million people from slavery without starting World War III. That is the ultimate definition of statesmanship. In the center of Berlin today, at the old Tempelhof Airport, there stands a monument. It is a soaring concrete structure with 3 prongs reaching into the sky, symbolizing the 3 air corridors used by the Allies. The Germans call it the Hunger Claw because of its shape, but its official name is the Airlift Memorial. At its base, the names of the 78 fallen airmen are inscribed in stone. It points upward toward the gray German sky, where the planes once came in an endless stream, a permanent reminder of the year when the sound of engines meant life. And somewhere in the quiet of history, Harry Truman is smiling. He didn't just save a city, he saved the soul of the West.
He proved that democracy could be tougher, smarter, and more compassionate than dictatorship. The airlift was his message to the future. We stay, we build, we feed, period.